So I am Jeremy Fricke, and I'm Education Director at Tri-Faith Initiative. And you are here for Abraham's Whiteboard, Love Your Enemies. We're going to be talking about science, religion, and our drive for compassion. So Abraham's Whiteboard is intended to be kind of a hodgepodge of topics once a month on different topics related to religion and how they connect to Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. And today we're going to be going through a few different things. Firstly, we'll do a quick recap over the last class, and then we'll talk about love and enemies and loving your enemies, and then also why does this matter and how can we apply some of this? And then we'll have a little time for questions and discussion. And just so you know, throughout the presentation, if you have any questions or comments or anything, feel free to use either the chat box or stop me for a second. You can just say, "Hey, Jeremy," and let me know what you're thinking. So just to remind a little bit, some of you were at the last session, but this is kind of an offshoot a little bit of the last one. Some new information, some repeated. But last time we talked about some of the relationship between science and religion, and in particular what we call evolutionary psychology of religion, which is basically, it's not really about like evolution even really. It's more about, what are the advantages to religion for humans? What is the kind of material advantage for that? And we went through three main ways that we can look at religion in the evolutionary psychology lens. And one is as an adaptation, which is the idea that religion is its own category of thinking and of acting. And it is something that it's a trait that evolved to some extent in people or adapted from people. There's also religion as a byproduct, which religion as a byproduct is like when we have multiple traits, and religion today would be defining the space between those traits. We talked a little bit about something called a spandrel, which, when you create a bridge, you've got, actually, I'll just point out here. So on the screen here, these triangles, right? So a spandrel is you have these 3 points. So these three would be traits. Things like a need for community and a need for understanding role in society and something else here. And religion would be in here. That's that theory, that the idea would be that what we call religion is the space in between those things. And then religion as a meme, which we talked about how sometimes very controversial ideas can have very beautiful implications if we think about them, think about kind of the core of what they're trying to say. So religion as a meme was proposed by Richard Dawkins, and it's basically a theory on how our religious stories came to be. The idea that stories themselves benefit individuals and societies, and they're a very organic process, that the story takes on a new life depending on its context. So as this story is repeated, it is utilized for the specific situation that we're in. So those are the three main things that we talked about last time. And while I probably won't directly reference much of this, it kind of is behind the scenes in some of what we're going to be talking about today. So just again, our our focus tonight is really on positivity. You know, this selection cycle and this circumstance around the world is not not something that is really bringing love and compassion and positivity to the forefront of my own mind, at least. I don't know about all of you, but what I'd like to do is kind of focus on the idea of hope in these three categories, and how that's impacted by some of the things that we're going to be talking about. I also wanted to mention before we get too started, so yesterday was the 7th anniversary of my spouse and I being engaged, and we really loved this passage. This is actually a passage from the Baha'i faith. It's a pretty famous quote, though, about love. You know, love gives life to the lifeless. Love lights a flame in the heart that is cold. Love brings hope to the hopeless and gladdens the hearts of the sorrowful. In the world of existence, there is indeed no greater power than the power of love. And that was something very meaningful. We, as you might expect of me, at least, we had a few different religious conversations about love at our wedding, and this was one of them. So let's try to discuss a little bit here. So I'd like to hear from all of you. You know, what are some ways to define love? And if you'd like, you know, compare that a little bit to compassion. And then after you think about that, we'll also talk about our relationship with others. Would anyone like to talk a little bit about how they might define love?
Well, love to me means you know, how you treat people, how you want to be treated, compassion, trust, passion, empathy, sympathy. I mean, you can't live without love. Basically, that's my motto. I mean, you can't live without it. Is there like a fine line? I guess. But to me, you know, love is all encompassing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you love every waking minute because you know, it's not always, you know, tangible. I mean, it's, you know, you love what you do. You love your friends. You love nature. You know, there is care and devotion in what you do in life, and that is love. So that's what I think.
Yeah.
I think it's unconditional,
Okay.
truly loving.
Mm-hmm. And Carrie Pratt says that she's heard of at least 3 words in Greek that are translated as love. That's true. Yeah, we often use adjectives with love to describe, and some languages just have different words for those combinations. Carrie Dietz Pillen. Love is a verb and an action that you can choose toward anybody. And Teresa says, when I think of love, I think of connection and of acceptance, of valuing something or someone else as much or more than myself. Yeah, these are all true. You know, I mean, love is a broad word, and I think we're going to use it fairly broadly here, but we'll talk about maybe some of the more finer details as we go.
I have a thought.
Yeah.
So I noticed that myself and Eileen raised our hands, so I don't know if you were looking at that part, and so that's fine. I think that the word love in so many ways, I mean, I think it's fine to say like, I love pie or something like that, but I think that it's used too generically. You see people who don't know anybody, you know, oh, I love you all, I love you people, you know, that kind of thing. But to me, at the base level, kind of the difference between compassion and love. So I can feel compassion for people. I can want to help them. Love is where I feel like I would put that person ahead of me. I would do something for that person, maybe at risk to myself, or, you know, certainly for your children, you'd put your life ahead of theirs. So to me, love is really that, like that level of love is that deepest part. Do you value this person more than, you know, would you put them ahead of yourself? And then I think there's a whole nother medium level of love that is how you love your friends and the activities in your synagogue or your church or whatever. So I wish we had variations on the word love.
Yeah.
Because it's too wide of a range.
Right. No, that's true. That's true. Those are good points. I'm sorry, I didn't see all the hand raises. Eileen.
I guess some of us are just used to being in groups and raising our hands.
Yeah, my apologies.
No problem. A lot of people had some very good information that they just shared. When I think of love, I think of it as a very strong emotion. So, you know, one of the positive ways that we express emotion is love. And also love has a very psychological type factor, because people want to be loved. They want to think that people love them. You know, so that can also affect a person, not only in a positive way, but, you know, just by showing people the emotion, they can, you know, picks them up and makes them feel better. And so, you know, you express the emotion and then they receive that in a positive light. Right. So that helps them.
Right. And would anyone like to make a comment about the difference between a neighbor and an enemy? Maybe we can come back to this. Actually, maybe think about this. We'll come back to it when we get to this conversation a little further down the line. Think about, you know, is there a difference and what that difference might be? And we'll come back to that. So something that's, you know, I'm going to reiterate this a couple of times because I think it's very, very important to grasp, is this idea that humans have a universal, or at least near universal, capacity to love. So firstly, I'm saying capacity, right? I'm not saying that everyone is always loving all the time. But when I'm saying universal, I'm not just saying like every single person has the capacity to love, but I'm also saying that people have the ability to imagine a universal love. So again, what I'm saying is, you know, a human can understand the idea of the actual idea of humanity, right? The idea that there are many more people beyond the people that we know. We'll come back to that a little bit more soon. And when I'm going to be talking about compassion, although, you know, and to me, the words matter, but maybe meanings matter more than the words themselves, or definitions matter more than the words themselves. So, you know, when I'm talking about compassion, I'm going to be talking about, basically, it'll be a synonym for empathy. The idea that the type of love where you provide it to somebody who's in distress or suffering because you understand suffering or distress. That's how I'm going to define compassion for the remainder of this class. So, and we know that mammals, and really animals in general, but mammals in particular, have some basic capacities for love. And they have some of them even have the ability to be compassionate. So what I mean is, when a mammal, and in particular primates, when a primate sees a another primate in pain, they often it affects them emotionally. They know what that pain feels like, or at least they feel something about that. They definitely respond in ways that are different from like a bug would, right? An ant or something would not. While they may recognize pain, they don't show any signs of compassion. They continue on their way, and they just recognize that this other ant is damaged. And in particular, there's a great example of a case study. 1964, a bunch of psychiatrists studied some rhesus monkeys, and what they did was they set up a system where they would get fed if they pulled this chain. And if the chain was pulled, it would shock a monkey that was across the wall of the cage, right? So they have two separate groups. On one side, you've got the group that has a chain, and the other side has a group that can get shocked if the chain is pulled. And they only get food if they pull the chain. Now, this is a terrible experiment. They probably should have never done this experiment. But what they found was that once they learned that the chain would shock the other side, they stopped pulling it, for a long amount of time. They even found one monkey did not eat for 12 days because they were not willing to pull that chain to hurt the other side with those monkeys. So other animals also do have the ability to have compassion even beyond some of their own family groups, especially with those that they can see. So we also have some questions from evolutionary psychologists. What does love and compassion do for us, right? So again, with evolutionary psychologists, it's really all about selfishness to some extent. What improves the ability for this gene to be passed on? And this is something that they don't know, we don't know, but it is clear that mutual love and compassion allow us to create these connections that last a long time. It creates a stronger foundation for the society around it. It helps us to be resilient, right? We have a reliance that if we are in trouble, then others can support us. And then we also have a theory, basically. So often when you talk about evolutionary psychology, we're talking about an individual traits. David Sloan Wilson, who we'll talk about in a second here, he argues that there's also something that we should be considering with group adaptations, that the community matters too. It's not just the traits of the individual, it's the traits of community. So this idea that if a community is compassionate and loving, then they will do better than a community that's full of fighting and rivalry and over competition, right? So they will last through difficult times much better. And this applies to us too, today. I think that's a lesson that we should probably learn. Then David Sloan Wilson. So he writes a book called Does Altruism Exist? And if you're interested in this kind of topic, definitely look into that book. He's talking about the idea that, the circular reasoning of altruism is, are we actually selfless? Do we have the potential to be selfless? do we always do things because we feel good after? And this is an argument for sure, but I think David Sloan Wilson and many other psychologists would argue that while most of the time that is not true, there are certainly circumstances where people act selflessly. So I would like to have a quick conversation here. Is there anything that you find particular about the ability for humans to have compassion? Is there something special about humans that allow us to succeed in this way?
We have an ability to put our feeling of self aside, that we can see the someone else and someone else's needs, or maybe a gratification they would have if we were particularly nice to them or something. We can put that first before our needs, of the ability to set aside ourself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Even though we analyze, that it would harm us, we tend to, because we have a strong power of analysis, but even through that.
I also think that I've witnessed and experienced, I think what I would say, altruism in caregiving. I worked in hospice for a long time, and I saw examples of people who did things because it was right to do it, not because it was easy or, it was certainly a choice, but it might not have made them feel that good, but it was right. And I see that as altruism in caregiving situations.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah,
It seems like that, and I don't know, because I've always had kind of a value system that's based in, theology and so on. But it seems like if you have a certain, it's a core value that's integrated into the self, that it's part of who you are, and therefore that would be something that would allow us to, act in that way.
Right. Yeah, that's true. So one thing that I want to add, and I mentioned it briefly before, but the one thing that I want to really drive home about human love and compassion is that ability to imagine the other that isn't in front of you, right? There is, as far as I know, there is no other animal, for example, that has the ability to really take a grand view of the world, right? And I'll have a couple of quotes by Valerie Kaur, who, if you haven't watched the video, we had her last month, and she had a fantastic talk with us. Definitely go on our YouTube channel and check it out. But she has this famous quote in there that says, "You are not a stranger. You are a part of me I do not know yet." And I think that really drives home a little bit, that you can recognize the shared humanity in other people, even if you do not know them, even if you haven't seen them. I think that's it's very special to humans. We have a capacity for love to be our default because of this, and we have the ability for our love to be all-encompassing because of this. So before we move on here, I want to go back to the question I had earlier. You know, what is the difference between a neighbor and an enemy? And you can feel free to answer in the chat or speak up here. Oh, oops.
I think it's if you know their story.
Okay. So neighbors are someone who you know their story. Enemies are someone who you do not.
Potential enemies.
Potential enemies.
In the Good Samaritan story, the neighbor was the Samaritan who took care of the person in need. I think you could turn that around the other way too, that that you can see the neighbor as the person, you can see the need in another person, and that makes you be their neighbor and responsible for addressing their needs.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point too. Would anyone else like to add? What is an enemy? Okay, Luann says.
I'm curious if any of the spiritual text define the difference between a neighbor and an enemy, or is that where you're going?
Well, yeah, I'm going adjacent to that. I would not say that it clearly defines what an enemy or a neighbor is, but that's I mean they use those terms, and I think those terms are worth discussing what they are intended to encompass. All right, so so you know the Abrahamic traditions and many others have the golden rule, which is basically, you know, love your neighbor as yourself. You know, as said in Leviticus and repeated by Jesus in Matthew, and then Muhammad also says that none of you will believe until you love for your brother that which you love for yourself in the Hadith. Neighbors are obvious. I mean, we all believe that neighbors are generally good, you know, and that, but we do disagree a little bit on exactly where that lies. I mean, this is actually a big point in theology for particularly, I mean, well, for all three of the Abrahamic traditions here. You know, I've heard the Imam and Reverend Elness talk about what a neighbor is. You know, the Imam says that, well, you should start with your neighbor, because that's who you can see. You know, you can make an impact on that person, and you know when you've made an impact. And you know, some people argue for starting with a very universal conception of neighbor. You know, that it's basically all of humanity, right? And I just want to also add a couple of interesting things that Teresa is talking about here. That the neighbor feels close in distance. Okay, so that also I feel like applies a little bit to relationship too. An enemy can be any distance, but is often kind of thought of as over there somewhere. You know, even if they're close, they're over there. But what was that?
You know, I was going to add too, you know, that there is an old Arabic, you know, proverb, you know, loosely translated means your closest, you know, neighbor is, let's see, you can count on your closest neighbor better than you can count on your distant family relative or brother. So, and also, the concept of neighbors, at least in, Arabic society, is, they are like an extension of your family. They are usually, the first, to respond to calamity, assistance, times of need. That's why, the prophet, peace be upon him, and other prophets, have always said, love thy neighbor, because, of the, closeness in the relationship, between, you and your next door neighbor, your down the street neighbor, because, that's a sub, set, of the greater society. So,
Right. Right.
yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And there's a lot of value to defining neighbor clearly, because I do think that sometimes people get wrapped up if when they define neighbor really broadly, then you kind of lose track of what you're doing. I think sometimes
Right.
it can be a little difficult to really help your neighbor if everyone's your neighbor,
Mhm.
But enemies, right? Often so this is the namesake of it, of this program. What is so different about enemies? And we often think of them as really defined by that lack of compassion and love, whether it's from them, right, where enemies do not provide you that love and compassion, or whether it's your relationship with them where you do not provide for them. Enemies are a different relationship altogether from neighbor, and they sorry, I lost my train of thought here. Enemies are complicated, and we know that most of the major traditions have some kind of teaching about having a positive relationship with enemies, which we'll go into next here. Although it's a little bit controversial as to exactly what that relationship is. Let's start by talking about Judaism, and again, feel free if you have anything to add to what I have here, feel free. I want to first just read these three out loud really quick. So in the Avot of Rabbi Nathan, he says, "Who is the greatest of all heroes? One who turns an enemy into a friend." And in Proverbs, they talk about if your enemy is hungry, give them bread to eat, and if they are thirsty, give them water to drink. And this commentary is on the Avot of Rabbi Nathan. Someone who can achieve an enormous act of strength without lifting a finger, but rather by exercising clear judgment, engaging in compassionate and empathetic listening, and using finely tuned skills in negotiation and conflict resolution. Such a person is the most powerful person in the world. So we find, while it does not say love your enemies, it does say to have some kind of loving intent, I think. Again, this is something that people argue about, but what would loving your enemies look like in Judaism, or how do you read these as guidance for how to love an enemy?
I read these as, showing like restraint and showing, compassion while recognizing, okay, what the threat is, you know, they don't want to lose this person because, again, if, you know, you can convert an enemy into a friend, I mean, that's what we live for. You know, we do this by trying to, you know their story, understand, you know, their situation, you know, what, you know, made them or turned them, you know, into, you know, enemies, adversaries, call them what you want. So, yeah, I think these are universal too.
Yeah. So there's definitely an attention to justice as part of this. For sure. Yeah. Would anyone else?
I think there's the idea also of just turning the other cheek. In other words, if you, I'm laughing because it's really easy for me to find fault or whatever in somebody else, you know, but if you just kind of try to put all that negativity aside and, you know, view them with compassion and just turn the other cheek to all the negative piece and just try to view them out of pure love.
And I have something. So in Judaism, we talk a lot about tikkun olam, healing the earth, healing the world. We don't say healing only our friends and neighbors. It's about everybody. And I think that, to me, part of that is about making your enemies or your stranger your friends. Because in social action, we don't say, I'm only going to help these kinds of people. We say, we're going to help whoever needs help. And that's like one of the major tenets of Judaism. So that, to me, is really saying, try to make that enemy your friend or your neighbor.
Yeah, that's good insight.
Can I counter that?
Sure.
Respectfully, Sherry.
I still love you, cuz.
I think in Reform Judaism, that's true. And I think that some of the teachings in traditional Jewish teachings would be bothersome to many of us if we were reading them here today, because the preservation of the Jewish people required that they put Jews in front of non-Jews, and the enemy was hard to see in the same image of God.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. And it's also, I think, important to note, you know, that it's, you know, it's not clear to any of our traditions exactly whether what the hierarchy is really, you know, what's the priority? What's the priority when it comes to loving God, neighbor, enemy, self, family? I mean, I think there's arguments for all those. And sometimes those needs do come in conflict, even from a place of love and compassion.
I would add on that I think some of the love and compassion that I think is most required in this time is to appreciate that there's such a spectrum of each of our religions, and that perhaps what we see in public about how Christianity is represented, or that any of our words have been hijacked by the religious other who might be the other in our own religious traditions. And I think sometimes that's even more painful than watching that happen in a tradition that you are not a part of.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very difficult to work kind of within your own tradition. It's too close to home.
Wendy, I just want to comment on that. I think that you just hit on a really sensitive point, because especially, I think, in the Reform movement, we think that we all think the same, and we don't. And it is jarring kind of morally jarring a little bit to bump up against someone in your congregation, in your community that has really different opinions, and not just different opinions about little things, but different opinions about things that we think are really about your morals and your character. That's a really tough one.
Yeah. Those are some really good insights. I think there's so much more that could be said about this. So I do want to talk a little bit about Christianity and Islam also. You know, they have slightly different, slightly similar, different interpretations about this same kind of teaching. And really, you know, the namesake to some extent is, you know, love your enemies. This is kind of a controversial thing in Christianity, I think. The idea that, you know, what defines love your enemies. I think often it's sort of seen as this kind of fluffy thing where you're supposed to ignore the injustices or potential legitimate reasons for why there's a strained relationship there. And this is what is said here is you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And so the term here that is used is agape, which many of you may know. It's basically a very specific definition of love. Christian theology, it is the love that is godly love. Really, it's the love that is between humans and God most of the time when it's used. But this is like a very powerful, encompassing love, and it's used for both your enemies and your neighbor here in this passage. You know, and I'd like to hear what everyone thinks of that. You know, how do you read the agape perspective on loving your enemies and praying for those who persecute you?
Well, all religions, you know, we want salvation, and you know, pray for those who persecute. You know, you are actually, you know, praying at, you know, God, you know, shows his, you know, mercy, you know, in a way that they change their behavior, because, you know, whether, okay, we are Christians, you know, Jews, you know, Muslims, okay, we all have that belief that, okay, we are right. So anybody who, you know, persecutes our beliefs, okay, we want to pray for that person to change, because they are going to meet God one day. And, you know, yeah, I just lost my train of thought and what I wanted to say after, so I'll come back to it.
I mean, I think that's great. Would anyone else like to add?
I think that one thing that I think about is, and I don't really know, but it just keeps coming up in my mind in the Christian faith, you know, where, when Christ was asked, where will we find you? And he says, the least among you, so you do unto me. And I think there's that whole idea that you look at whoever crosses your path, whether technically they would be your enemy or not, you at least attempt to see the face of Christ in that person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely some overlap here with the Jewish perspective we talked about not long ago, where there's kind of there's a hope that an enemy doesn't have to stay an enemy, at least not forever, right? I think that there's something there about praying for change might be too strong of a word. It's more like a hope that that somebody may recognize their issue. There are definitely some great comments in the chat that you should definitely read as well. I'd also like to add Islam and loving enemies. Good and evil cannot be equal. Respond with what is best, and then the one you feud with will become a close friend.
Is there a difference there if the person you're calling an enemy is more powerful than you, or the person you're calling an enemy is weaker, or less wealthy, or less well off? It seems to me there's a difference there in the way you might react to those people.
Well, you tell me. What's the difference?
Well, if someone is more powerful than me and feels like they're out to get me or doing things that are aimed at hurting me, I think I'm going to have a lot harder time trying to find a place to meet up with them than I might if there was someone who was weaker than me and I maybe could help try to make their life better. So somehow, to me, there seems like there's a difference there.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. I sometimes say, that the scriptures aren't like paid by the word, right? They're fairly succinct. They say a lot in a short amount of words, and there's a lot of things to define for ourselves when we read them. So, I mean, those are things that are worth pondering, and I think are meant to be pondered a little bit. How to work with the complexity that is not always discussed that well in our scriptures. Would anyone else like to add to what they see in this verse from the Quran?
Well, I think, respond with what is, best. Translate to, use your, judgment and how you want to treat people, especially, those, like, Jean said. Sorry, Jean, I had to click on you to see your name. So, you would, obviously, gauge, your treatment or, your responsiveness, to a person. Like, you're not going to, respond well to a person who is a phobe of everything, who is outright, nasty, as opposed to, a person, okay, who may, have a misunderstanding and is just, hearing what they have heard, okay, and not knowing. So, responding like, by your actions. Okay, you live, your life according, okay, to the 10 Commandments or to Christ's, teachings, okay, Muhammad's, teachings. So living your religion, through your, daily actions, okay, will, help in, trying to change the outlook of that enemy, towards you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think
this one a lot. It's, it doesn't, the good and the evil cannot be equal. No. But just this idea of respond with what is best, I think is something that everyone has said somewhere or other. If you do, all you can do is work with yourself, and to whatever situation it is there in front of you. If you respond with your best, you can develop a relationship as much better than if you're annoying and complaining and just turning your back on them with a cowl. The idea of return, just respond with what is best. I love the profound simplicity of this.
Yeah, very action oriented. Particularly action oriented for in comparison to the three, and I picked out some of the most famous ones, but there are other options as well.
And it reminds me also of the quote that you had from Valerie at the beginning, like your ability to see yourself in others, and also like the concept of non-dualism, that if and I think I see this in Judaism also, though, in the oneness piece, that if you covet something or you admire something in someone else, it exists in you, and what you fear in a terrorist also exists in you because of our oneness.
Yeah, that ability to really understand people is a powerful blessing and curse, I think, to some extent, of humans.
That concept of ecosystem, right? Like we can't separate ourselves from it because we're daily impacted by the fact that we live amongst good and evil.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm actually going to get to Valerie Kaur one more time here too. Mostly because I think she speaks to a lot of the things that have been brought up today in conversation, and even provides us with a little bit of practicality. And I'll just read this out loud. Revolutionary love is a wellspring of care, an awakening to the inherent dignity and beauty of others and the earth, the quieting of the ego, a way of moving through the world in relationship, asking, what is your story? What is at stake? What is my part in your flourishing? Loving others, even our opponents, in this way has the power to sustain political, social, and moral transformation. This is how love changes the world. So this is from her recent book, which is called See No Stranger, and she talks about this idea of revolutionary love, which isn't so fluffy, right? It's not blind love. It's love with an eye on justice, basically. And so what do you notice about any of this? Does any of this speak to you? Does any of this not speak to you when looking at your own religious traditions or philosophies?
I noticed the term, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's another case of letting go of your ego, and then there's lots of possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I noticed the term relationship. That's one of the first places it's come up in the slide set. And once you have relationship, then there's a much greater potential to view another in a more positive, empathetic way.
Right. And I'm actually gonna come back to that one. So I think my favorite three parts of that section is the questions that you're supposed to ask when you're trying to, walk through the world and decide on how to treat others. right? What is your story? What is at stake? And what is my part in your flourishing? Right, so what is your story? Understand where people are coming from, or really try, and that's not, it's not really relevant who it is. I mean, whether it's an enemy or a neighbor or something else. Understand people's stories. It doesn't give them a pass. Just because you understand them does not mean that anything negative just stops being negative. It just means you understand where it comes from. Number two, what is at stake? So this is, at least in my view, the focus on when you love somebody, you also have to love the people around them, right? So what is at stake? Because sometimes you have to make choices. You have to make difficult choices. And when you have someone who's abusing somebody else, you have something at stake there with how you interact with love toward them, right? Those things, and there's a lot at stake with every relationship, right? And we have a responsibility to a lot of people, and including ourselves, which I think is kind of this last part, which is, what is my part in your flourishing? So when we're talking about earlier, I can't remember who it was now, but somebody, I believe, was talking about, the difficulty of finding the capacity to work with people who they see as enemies. I think it might have been Jean, kind of, right? You were talking about how is, what is the difference between working with somebody or loving an enemy who is very powerful versus loving an enemy who is not very powerful. Sometimes your part is not a big part. Sometimes the best thing you can do for people is to not be involved. We're not responsible to every single person that we ever come across. Sometimes the best thing you can do is focus on yourself, or focus on the people who you can love and support and need that. It's not all about, have that perfection every time. We all do things a little bit differently. So I think that these are 3 good things to think about when engaging with people, when you are really trying to apply kind of a revolutionary love ideal, or this love your neighbor, love your enemy ideal. So let's just recap really quick. We have a special capacity to love and to have compassion to people everywhere. We have the ability to recognize the entirety of humanity. This is something very special to humans, and it allows us to see people both as neighbors and as enemies and as potential friends. That the ability to see the humanity in an enemy is the ability to see them able to change, able to stop being an enemy in some capacity. And Abrahamic traditions also have this call for humans to see the potential in all people to change, to not be an enemy anymore. And just kind of to cap off, I would like to know, does anybody have any questions? Is there anything that I missed that you would have liked to hear about?
Well, I am glad we did not define what an enemy is formally, so that was pretty good.
Well, an enemy is impermanent.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be permanent.
No.
I think that's one thing that the religious traditions all teach us. that enemies don't have to be permanent.
You've given me a way to kind of look at the current political situation in a little different way than I think I have. I mean, nothing has been more them versus me, or, you know, you versus me, than the current political situation. But I keep trying to find out how do I find a place to discuss with people who I don't agree with, find a meeting place with them. Those 3 questions that you came up with from Valerie's book kind of give us the opening to do that, don't they?
I hope so.
Think the way you do, for you to flourish, what does that mean to me, or what can I do to help you flourish, and what is at stake? If we do things your way, what's going to happen? If we do things my way, what's going to happen?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That kind of gave me some resolution.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And definitely, if you haven't seen Valerie Kaur's video, definitely watch it. And Wendy posted it in the chat. And also, you know, check out her book. It's very good. Are there any other things that people would like to talk about? To me, the hardest part to me is, you know, knowing, you know, that everybody sort of has a role to play when it comes to working with people who are sort of the quote opposition, right? We don't all have the same. We don't all have the same abilities. We don't all have the same, you know, strengths and weaknesses. But we all have a bit of a role to play to help the world be full of fewer enemies. But it's not all the same role. And I think that really thinking about, you know, what is your role in this process is rather than what is the best role, you know, what is your role is an important task that really only you can decide for yourself. And